Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Coast to Coast Hockey. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into everything to do with the Florida Panthers. My name's Cameron.
I'm Noel.
And I'm Nick.
Let's get started.
It was a busy offseason for the Panthers on the additions front. Most notably, they brought in Evan Rodriguez, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, and Nico Mikkola. They also brought in Dmitry Kulikov, Stolares, and other depth pieces.
On the subtractions front, defenseman Radko Gudas, notable hitter, as well as Anthony Duclair, Mark Stahl, and other players have since left the team because of these additions.
Moving on to some of the bigger names that were brought in this offseason by GM Bill Zito. The first one here is Evan Rodriguez. This is a forward who's versatile. He can play up and down the lineup, center or left wing. He's been known to be a bit of an analytics darling. Guys like Kyle Dubas have actively tried to pursue him in the past. Last season, he stepped up in a huge way for the Colorado Avalanche as they were dealing with injuries. He put up 39 points in 69 games, which was really impressive for him. The year before that, he put up 43 in 82 games. This is also a forward who's very good defensively, so he's going to be a huge addition to the top nine and probably the top six here in Florida.
The second biggest arrival for Florida was Oliver Ekman-Larsson, OEL. This is a guy who has now been around the league a bit. He once a captain of the Arizona Coyotes, then moved to Vancouver after a buyout with retained salary, and now he has found his place in Florida on a one-year, $2.25 million deal. This is a guy who at one point was a decent offensive defenseman and a power play quarterback for the Coyotes, and now finds his way into a depth spot with the Florida Panthers.
Mikkola split time between the Blues and Rangers last year and was signed to a 3-year, $2.5 million AAV contract by the Panthers in the offseason. It's quite a rich contract for what is a depth defenseman. He had 6 points through 81 games last year and is more known for his peripherals. He's a bigger guy and does provide some solid hits and blocks.
Moving on from the arrivals to the future outlooks for this Florida Panthers team. Not one of the deepest prospect pools in the NHL. It's kind of been depleted with going out and acquiring players, but some players of note there are Samosevic, Sachin, and Sordif, as well as Denisenko.
The Panthers were buyers in previous deadlines, so you can see they're missing some of their top end draft capital. So the two first round picks and a second round pick are gone, and they will look to continue to be buyers as they try to stay competitive in a cutthroat Eastern Conference.
Now with the prospect spotlight for the Florida Panthers, our first prospect of note is Mackie Samoskevich. This is a 5'11" right winger slash centerman. I prefer him to play on the wing. He is a very small, crafty player that puts up some points. As you can see there in college in the NCAA, as a sophomore, he put up 43 points in 39 games, an upgrade from the previous year of only 29 in 40, but that's still a decent freshman year. This is a guy who came out of Chicago in the USHL, which, if you're looking to have a great career and not play in the US NDTP, you can play in the USHL on a select few teams, such as the Chicago Steel, one of the most notable teams in that league, with great development opportunities, which then led to this college opportunity, and now you see him blossoming in college. He was drafted 24th overall in the first round in 2021. And I see him as a great forechecker and more of a winger piece, similar to maybe a Sam Bennett on the same team in the future, but with a bit more offensive potential. The second prospect of note is Grayson Sachin. This is a 5'11" centerman, another smaller guy, but who puts up a lot of points. He was drafted in the second round, 63rd overall. He also boasts a great amount of forechecking skill and energy. He has a big motor that he's going to keep going the whole game, despite not the greatest skating skill, but either way, he's going to be a big piece to the future of the Florida Panthers, in my opinion, alongside Samoskevich. Samoskevich has a bit more speed and potential when it comes to the playmaking and the skill with the hands, but Sachin is such a forechecker and a grinder that he'll be able to put up points. As you see there, he put up a point a game, 58 points in 58 games last year. The third prospect of note, who is still a prospect at this point, is Grigory Denisenko. This is a boomer bust kind of guy. He was drafted 15th overall, sort of with a bit of unsureness whether he would be a surefire NHLer. As you can see, he only played 18 games in the NHL last year, but had decent AHL numbers for Florida's affiliate. While being drafted 5 years ago, this is a guy who's already 23 and still trying to find his game in North America. I'd be curious to see how long the leash is for this guy as he looks to cement a spot in any lineup. Maybe this is the year that he makes the Florida Panthers lineup, but we'll have to see.
Speaking of which, we're going to move on to the projected lineup for the Florida Panthers, beginning with the forward lines here. So as you can see on that top line, Evan Rodriguez is going to slide into that left wing spot with Barkov and Reinhart. That's the place where Duclair used to be before he got moved via cap dump this offseason. That second line is a really good second line with Carter Verhaeghe, Sam Bennett, and Matthew Tkachuk. Matthew Tkachuk is dealing with some injuries. I believe he had a shoulder surgery at the during the offseason, so hopefully he's at 100% to start off the season, but we'll have to wait and see there. Carter Verhaeghe's a guy who's going to threaten to put up 40 goals every single season, and Sam Bennett's a guy who, with physicality and offense, is able to drive play. So he's a really great player to have in that top six. The third line is where the question marks begin for me with Luostarinen, Lindell, and Denisenko. All three are young guys who are looking to make a name for themselves in the NHL. Lundell and Luostarinen have had some success in the NHL at this point. Denisenko has not. So it'll be interesting to see how they mesh and if that can be a positive line for this team. And then the fourth line is one that I like as well with Ryan Lomberg, Steven Lorentz, and Nick Cousins, all guys who are good fourth liners in this league. Lomberg in particular brings great energy, and Cousins is a guy who can play up and down the lineup as well.
Onto the defensive pairs for the Florida Panthers. This projection involves some interesting tidbits here. We've got Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour with injuries that could take them out for quite a bit of the start of the season. So this is sort of a lineup with them in it. But as you can see with the extras, think of those players in the lineup to start the season, such as Dmitry Kulikov and Mike Riley primarily. That puts Gustav Forsling as sort of the top defenseman for the team. He's going to have a lot of work to do for the D-corps. That's why they brought in guys like Mikkola and Ekman-Larsson with anticipation that Ekblad and Montour would not be ready just yet. But this lineup, without those two premier right-handed defensemen, boasts 6 lefties and is pretty weak at this point without those two stars, Ekblad and Montour.
And finally, looking at the goalies here, we have some solid depth for the Florida Panthers. Bobrovsky is obviously the guy. He's being paid 10 mil, former Vezina winner, and he had an interesting season last year where he struggled a bit in the regular season, but absolutely popped off in the playoffs, bringing the Florida Panthers all the way to the Stanley Cup final. Spencer Knight also had a kind of a tumultuous year last year. Was a very touted prospect going into the season, but kind of had some poor performances on the ice and some off ice issues that he was dealing with. So he's looking to bounce back in a big way. And finally, the new addition, Anthony Stolarz from Anaheim. He played solid last year as well, behind a pretty brutal Anaheim team. So 3 really good pieces in net for Florida. We'll see which one gets hot at the right time and Bobrovsky will be the starter, but that backup is kind of wide open.
Moving on from our lineups to the storylines surrounding this team headed into the season. The biggest one is, as you can see there, the injuries to the key players here. So everything starts and ends on this team with Matthew Tkachuk. He's really the motor behind their success, aside from Bobrovsky as well, obviously. But this is a guy who's put a back-to-back 100-point season. So his health is really going to dictate how far this team can go and their success in the regular season as well as the playoffs if they're able to make it that far. But then moving past the offense to the defense, losing Aaron Ekblad and Brandon Montour for any amount of time is going to be incredibly detrimental. Ekblad is a player who played over 23 minutes a game last season for the Panthers. Montour averaged over 24 minutes a game and put up 73 points for this team as the power play quarterback. So trying to fill those voids is going to be a massive test for this team. And I think this is definitely the biggest concern headed into the season.
They made it to the Stanley Cup finals last year, but at what cost? They've lost 3 of arguably their top 3 skaters. I guess Barkov in there as well. So top 5 skaters on the team. And one point that I do want to make is if they are able to weather the storm while these guys are out and then they get some reinforcements like a bit through the season, it could really add some more wind to their sails. So it really depends how they start. If their players like Forsling can step up and then get these guys. And I think Kachuk will be starting the season from what
Yeah.
I've heard, but I don't know about the two defense.
Yeah, fortunately, that Matthew Kachuk is a full participant in training camp this year. That'll help him with his rehab, being able to play some preseason before the meaningful games, the big 82. But the two defensemen, yeah, it looks to be that they're out for the first little bit of the season, and I worry definitely about the defensive side of the Florida Panthers. You're putting the burden on players like Gustav Forsling and Oliver Ekman-Larsson to carry that load and take on the top offenses in the league. Fortunately, you do have some great defensive forwards, like touted Alexander Barkov. This is a guy who has been known for his defensive prowess. He may have to play a little bit lower in the zone this year, perhaps to sort of take on those centermen that are going to be getting around these defensemen. But overall, this is a big loss for the team so far, and it was a pretty big sacrifice to make, and they came up short too, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think the health of Aaron Ekblad is always going to be in question. This is a guy who just can't seem to stay healthy. But just to add on to that as well, I know they did bring in some reinforcements on the back end, but they also lost Radko Gudas. So if you look at it in its totality, like they've lost three of probably their top three defensemen from that Stanley Cup run to begin the season. So it's going to be a really difficult storm for this team to weather here early on. Moving
Yeah.
on to, oh, did you?
One more thing to add is that you're asking a lot of lefties to play on their offside, and that's not something that everyone can do. I look to someone like Miro Heiskanen in Dallas being put on the right side because of all the lefties on that team, and he excels in that position specifically because of his talent and his skating. But you're asking players like Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Dmitry Kulikov, and Mike Riley to play on the right side as a lefty. There could be some issues down that wing throughout the season.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely the biggest question surrounding this team and why some people see them going from the Stanley Cup Finals to missing the playoffs this season. So it'll be really interesting to see how that unfolds. Moving on to our second storyline, um, just kind of wondering whether this goaltending tandem can hold up. Um, on paper, it looks like a good trio of goaltenders, really, if you want to throw Stolars in there as well. But uh, last year in the regular season, Sergei Bobrovsky had a 901 save percentage and a 3.07 goals against average in 50 games, whereas Spencer Knight put up the exact same, a 901 save percentage and a 3.18 goals against in 21 games. So obviously the off ice stuff with Spencer Knight, I think he came out and spoke recently. I think he was dealing with some obsessive compulsive disorder type stuff. So it's really good that he's been able to get that under control and he's feeling good and healthy mentally coming into the season. So really happy to see that from that perspective. But just in terms of this goaltending tandem, like they're paying Bobrovsky $10 million, and I believe they're going to be paying Spencer Knight $5 million this season. So the fact that it's a question is crazy, but you have to question it based on the totals they put up last season.
It's funny that you bring up their contracts, 10 million and 5 million for Bobrovsky and Knight respectively, and then you look at Vegas, who they lost to in the finals, who just rotate like younger and cheap NHL goalies. So quite the contrast. And we're questioning Florida's goalies and not Vegas. Bobrovsky's contract was one of the worst. People would say it was one of the worst in the league before he made that playoff run. So does that justify his contract dragging them to the Stanley Cup Finals? I don't know. So I'm kind of expecting regression from Bobrovsky. I think it was more of a fluke. I think that whole run was kind of they didn't. Well, yeah, I think they fluked their way into the finals and we saw them get decimated by Vegas. So I'm expecting some regression from Bobrovsky, definitely. And then I'm hoping Knight will be able to step up because he's a promising young talent in the league.
Yeah, and I think it's a difficult situation for Spencer Knight, knowing that he pretty much has no chance to be the number one guy. You can't really ask him or tell him that he's going to be a better or ahead of Bobrovsky in the depth chart because he's not making $10 million. He is not the first guy on the list. Bobrovsky's there for many years now. Florida has told this team they've inferred that basically this team is going to have Bobrovsky be their number one for the rest of his contract. Therefore, Knight will automatically be the number two or on the bench. So that's a pretty tough sell for a young guy who wants to play. This is a guy who obviously had the offense issues, and we really hope that he's kind of overcome that and been able to become the financial goalie that he wants to be this year. But I do think there is a bit of confidence issues there in Florida where it comes to being a young guy coming right in, and you want to be that impact player, but you can't when you're on the bench.
Yeah, I mean, I really see Bobrovsky taking a step back in the regular season at least. Like I think he just got hot at the right time, and I just don't see him as a consistent goalie at all anymore in the NHL. He's a lot. He'll be a Vezina goalie one season and then be a sub 900 save percentage goalie in the next season. You just never know what you're going to get from him on a given night, and so like you, I'm hoping that Spencer Knight will be able to take that step and kind of steal starts away from him and make this into more of a tandem 1A, 1B situation because obviously they're going to continue to play Bobrovsky with that cap hit. But also the addition of Stolars is nice as well because last year we saw Anthony, or sorry, I can't remember his first name, but Lyon, I think it was Alex Lyon. He
Mhm.
stepped in and got this team into the playoffs. So having that third goalie there is some good reassurance here as well. Moving on to our final storyline here, and it's a pretty interesting one because Oliver Ekman-Larsson is a player who the Vancouver Canucks gave up a lot to acquire him a few years ago. Obviously, the pick that turned into Dylan Guenther, which is probably the part that stings the most of that trade, but among other things, to get him and Connor Garland. Um, and he really disappointed when he came over to Vancouver. This is a player who was the captain in Arizona. He put up 5 40-point seasons with that team. But as soon as he came over to Vancouver, he regressed immediately. He put up 29 points and 22 points in his last two seasons, which were with the Vancouver Canucks. And this is a guy that Vancouver is now paying, 17 million over the next 8 years to not play for them. So it's just really interesting fall from grace. But if he is able to turn it around on a $2.25 million cap hit for the Florida Panthers, it's kind of like found money for them.
Yeah, I think Florida fans should be really happy about this signing. It's really low risk, high reward, and I think OEL is a depth piece. It still definitely has some value in the league. I think Vancouver is playing him a bit up in the lineup, relying a bit too much on him. So, as a depth piece on a Florida line, blue line, I think OEL will be really good.
Yeah, the only thing I'm curious about is what is Oliver Ekman-Larsson's special skill? What is the defining factor that makes him an impactful NHL defenseman? He seems to have sort of the average at everything but a master of none type of value to himself. So I'm curious to see where he fits into the lineup, whether that be on the offensive front of defenders or being just a defensive defenseman, sort of a stay-at-home. We don't really know in recent years what he's become because of his offensive regression. So I really wonder, is he still that offensive option for a team? Is he going to be a diamond in the rough sort of as that third pair guy? Or is he sort of just going to be a defenseman for the team this year?
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting. I think the one thing that is definitely going to play into his favor is the fact that uh, the Panthers are, at least watching them last year, they were kind of a run and gun team. They like to get up on the rush. So as a more offensively inclined guy who can kind of pick his spots sometimes, hopefully at this point in his career, jumping in onto the rush, that might bode well for him. And also, I think a good part of this too is starting the year with, obviously it's very sad for the team that Brandon Montour is injured, but that's going to probably make Oliver Ekman-Larsson the PP1 guy on this team. And that could be a really good opportunity for him to get his feet wet and kind of build some chemistry with some of the offensive players on this team. So
I would
only
argue that
time.
it's still Forsling on PB1, but that's
Yeah.
just not serious enough. But we'll see what happens.
Yeah, they can compete. It's
Maybe
a
the
bit
whole
it's a bit open for sure on that front. Like you obviously want to give that to someone like Montour with his agility and
Yeah.
his puck skills. OEL does not stand up close to that, unfortunately, at this point in his career. but he's still a decent NHL player that can provide some value for a team like Florida that definitely they need it for sure, at least at the start of the season.
Yeah, it's definitely Montour's spot when he returns from injury. That's not up for debate. But until then, I think it's pretty much wide open whether Forsling takes it or Oliver Ekman-Larsson. So if he's able to do that and establish himself uh, as a option on the power play for them, that would really do well for him and his career. So yeah, that's going to do it for the storylines. Moving on to our final segment here. Just going to do a broad overview of the offseason and season for the Florida Panthers. So, in terms of the grades, the offseason grade is going to be a B. I do like the risk of Oliver Ekman-Larsson. I think it's a low risk, high reward signing. I like the signing of Evan Rodriguez. Not a big fan of the Nico Mikkola signing at 3 years, 2.5 million. Kind of reminds me a bit of the Justin Hall signing, just overcommitting to a depth defenseman, in my opinion. It's really going to sting losing Duclair and Gudas. So obviously not the greatest offseason in terms of who came in and who went out, but they did all right with what they had. So it's going to be a pretty average B. In terms of offensive strength, it's going to be a B plus. Those top two lines can compete with anybody in the NHL when they're healthy. So that's really where that comes from. The bottom six isn't great, so it's not the best offensive depth, but some really good skill at the top end there. As far as the defensive depth goes, this can really, really vary. It really depends on the health of Brandon Montour and Aaron Ekblad. If those guys are in the lineup, this probably goes up to a B plus or maybe even A minus. But missing those guys, losing Gudas to start off the season, this could debatably be lower than a B. So only time will tell with that one. And then in terms of goaltending, I really just don't trust Bobrovsky or Knight at this point. The depth of Stolarz is nice, so we'll settle in on a B there and hope that it improves throughout the season. As far as the future outlook goes, this is a team that doesn't have many picks. It doesn't have many exciting young players, but they do have Matthew Tkachuk locked up long term. This is a dynamic player, debatably a top 10 player in the NHL. So that's going to bump it up into the B range, but can't go higher than a B minus for that.
Florida barely snuck into the playoffs last year, and we kind of only have them just missing the playoffs this year in our projected Eastern Conference wildcard race. We have them third, so just on the outside looking in. The East is so hard to predict. It really just depends on the injuries of this team, in my opinion. If these guys can come back and carry the momentum of an already successful Panthers team, they're easily going to make the playoffs. But if they get off to a rough start, I don't think those players will be enough to right the ship.
Moving on to our final graphic here, just the individual rankings. So Nick had the Panthers ranked 14th and making the playoffs. Noel had them ranked 21st and missing the playoffs. I had them ranked 15th and missing the playoffs. So that's going to result in an aggregate standing of 16th in the overall NHL and just falling short of the playoffs in that Eastern Conference. So Nick, if you wanted to get into why you see this team as a playoff team, take it away.
Absolutely. So compared to last year, I think they still have some great top two lines, and any playoff team that has two dynamic, impactful lines, I believe, will go at least make the playoffs. So I can see, as long as they keep splitting up the Barkov and Kachucks in their lineup, which they have been for the past couple of years tactically, like it's not usually the case where your two best players are not on the first line, but they're doing it in a way where they split up each of those assets and put them along guys that are going to play with them, such as Sam Reinhart with Barkov, a shooter with a passer, and then you've got Matthew Tkachuk and Bennett as the grinders who will get the puck to give it to Verhaeghe to get him 40 goals. So I really like those two lines to start. I also think that their defense it can hold up the lack of Ekblad and Montour in the time being, and I do think that their goaltending can't be much worse than the goaltending of teams like Ottawa and possibly Buffalo, but I argue that between Florida, Ottawa, and Buffalo, I'd put Florida and Buffalo together as the playoff teams. So I'd look to Florida to be sort of a dark horse as well, same as last year, but with the idea that they've got some playoff experience. So as soon as they get into the playoffs, they're going to be just as hungry, if not hungrier, than last year.
For
Yeah.
me, I have them so low at 21. Just I look at the fact that in the offseason, I think they moved sideways, if anything, back with the injuries, and the teams around them just got better within like Ottawa, Buffalo, Detroit. I mean, Boston got worse, but I still think they're better than Florida. So it's just due to the fact that teams around them will be better than they were last year, and I have Florida around the same as they were.
Yeah, it's similar for me. It's just kind of the hangover effect from that run to the Stanley Cup final. All the injuries that brought, and then missing guys like Radko Gudas, even Mark Stahl, who played a huge role for this team last year on defense. Like the defense has been completely overhauled, and I just don't know if it's going to be enough to carry them into a playoff spot, especially with some questions still remaining in net. So for me, that's why I don't have them making the playoffs. I like Buffalo more, but I think they're right in the thick of it with Buffalo, Ottawa, and the Islanders as well.
Yeah, the one piece I would like to add is I think out of all these teams that are sort of either growing or moving sideways, I think the one team you do fear mentally is the Florida Panthers. You fear Matthew Tkachuk, you fear Sam Bennett, you used to fear Rako Gudas, so that's a piece that they've lost. But pieces like Sam Bennett and Matthew Tkachuk, I do look. If you look down the barrel of the gun in the playoffs and you see, Matthew Tkachuk and Sam Bennett on your tail, I'd be worried about that more than I'd be worried about some, young prospects in Ottawa or young prospects in Buffalo for that matter.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're definitely built for the playoffs. It's just whether they can get there or
exactly.
not will be the question.
Exactly. Yeah, this is definitely a team. They proved it last season. If they get in the playoffs, anything can happen, but it's going to be really tough for this completely decimated team in terms of injuries and people leaving in free agency to get there in the first place. So I think they'll be right in until the end, but if they get there, like you said, Nick, I wouldn't want to play against them. They proved that last year, but that's going to be the toughest thing is making the playoffs for this team. So that's going to do it for the video on the Florida Panthers today. Thank you guys so much for watching. We hope to see you guys in the next video. Just over halfway done all the videos, so super excited to continue this series. And thank you guys so much for all the support. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe.